"Dad, it's me. You've been tricked." The sentence landed like a blow. Jonathan Hale stood rigid, his hand still mid-gesture, his mind refusing to accept what his ears had just heard. He turned sharply toward the voice. The girl was already walking toward him. She did not hesitate. She did not look to the sides for approval or fear. She walked straight to him, stopped, and lifted her face. "Dad," she said again, clear and firm. "I'm talking to you." Oh, Jonathan's first instinct was anger, the kind that rose automatically when control slipped away in public. "Who told you to say that?" he asked. "Why would you say I've been tricked?" "Because you have," the girl replied. "For 6 years." Her certainty unsettled him more than the words themselves. "This isn't appropriate," Jonathan said, keeping his voice low. "You don't even know me." "I know you," she answered. "You just don't know me." Menady. A faint murmur moved through the room, but Jonathan barely noticed it. He was studying her now, the way she stood too still, the way her eyes never dropped. "What's your name?" he asked. "Annie." The name struck him harder than he expected. "And why?" Jonathan continued carefully. "Would Annie think I'm her father?" "Because you are," she said. "And because your family lied to you." Jonathan exhaled slowly. "That's a serious accusation. If you're saying something like that, you need to explain yourself." "I will," Annie said. "But you asked me why you were tricked." "I'll start there." She took a step closer. Jonathan noticed then how small she was, how thin her arms looked inside the sleeves of her dress. "They told you I died," Annie said. "They told you my mom disappeared." None of that was true. Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I do," she insisted, "because my mom told me everything. She told me, your family made you choose. They made you sign something. They said it was for the best." The room felt suddenly too warm. "Stop," Jonathan said. "If you're going to accuse people, you'd better have proof." "I do." Jonathan hesitated, then nodded once. "Then prove it. Prove you're my daughter." Annie didn't answer right away. She looked up at him as if measuring whether he was ready. "You told my mom once," she said, "that silence can hurt worse than the truth." Jonathan's breath caught. He had said that. He remembered exactly when, exactly why. "That's not enough," he said quietly. "People say things all the time." "I know," Annie replied. "That's why I didn't start with that." She stepped closer still, close enough now that Jonathan could see a faint scar above her eyebrow. "You used to say," she went on, "that my name should sound like my mother's. You said it would remind you of her every time you said it out loud." Jonathan's heart began to pound. "My mom's name is Annette," Annie said. "You wanted to name me Annie because of her." Jonathan felt a wave of dizziness wash over him. "That's not something anyone would know," he murmured. Annie reached into her small bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it carefully, as if it mattered. "This is what you signed," she said. Jonathan took the paper with shaking hands. His eyes scanned the page, then stopped. He recognized the format instantly. The legal language, the date, and his signature. He stared at it, unable to speak. "You said you signed it so we'd be safe," Annie said. "You believed them." Jonathan felt the room fade at the edges. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "My mom kept it," Annie said. "She said one day it would matter." Jonathan swallowed hard. "That paper doesn't prove you're my child." "I know," Annie replied. "That's why there's more." She reached into her bag again, and this time pulled out a thin silver chain. It was simple, worn smooth by time. "You said it wasn't special," Annie said, "but you never took it back." Jonathan's hands trembled as he took the necklace. He knew it. He remembered buying it, remembered fastening it around Annette's neck, laughing about how it didn't suit her at all. His knees felt weak. "You told her," Annie continued softly, "that one day you'd give it to your daughter. You said it should stay in the family." Jonathan looked at the girl in front of him, really looked at her. The shape of her eyes, the set of her mouth. Something deep and undeniable shifted inside his chest. "Where is your mother?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "She's alive," Annie said. "But she's tired." And she's afraid. Jonathan closed his eyes. For 6 years, he had lived with a quiet ache, a doubt he never allowed himself to name. Now it rose up, sharp and undeniable. "They told me you were gone," he whispered. "They told me both of you were gone. They were wrong," Annie said. "Or they lied." Jonathan felt the weight of the years press down on him all at once. Boardrooms, contracts, success built on foundations he had never questioned deeply enough. "You're asking me to believe," he said slowly, "that everything I was told was false." "I'm not asking," Annie replied. "I'm telling you." The room was silent now. Jonathan Hale, a man who had built an empire on certainty, stood before a 6-year-old girl who had just taken it all away. He looked at the paper in his hands, the necklace, then back at Annie. If she was lying, this would end quickly. If she was telling the truth, 6 years of silence had already destroyed too much. "Come here," he said at last. Annie stepped closer, and in that moment, Jonathan realized he was no longer asking whether she was his daughter. He was asking himself how he could ever make up for the time he had lost. Jonathan Hale stood motionless, his eyes moving slowly from the little girl in front of him to the thin silver chain resting in his palm. The chain looked smaller than he remembered. Or perhaps his hands had simply grown heavier over the years, weighted by contracts, signatures, and decisions that never left a visible mark. He let it slip through his fingers once, feeling the cool metal against his skin, and something inside him cracked. "No," he murmured, barely audible even to himself. Annie watched him closely. She did not speak. She had learned, somewhere along the way, that adults needed silence more than reassurance. When the truth finally reached them, Jonathan lowered himself into the chair behind him, as if his legs had forgotten how to stand. He looked at the necklace again, then at Annie's face. The distance between past and present collapsed in on itself, folding years into a single, suffocating moment. "I bought this on a street corner," he whispered. "It was raining." She said it was too plain. Annie nodded slowly. "My mom said you joked that it looked like something a kid would wear." Jonathan let out a breath that trembled. "I told her I'd give it to our daughter one day," he said. "I said it should stay in the family." The word daughter echoed painfully in the space between them. Jonathan lifted his gaze to Annie again. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly look, not as a man defending his reputation, not as a billionaire accustomed to control, but as a father standing at the edge of a truth he had buried alive. The shape of her eyes, the way her mouth tightened when she was nervous, even the way she held herself quiet, guarded, but unbroken. He had seen that posture before, years ago, on a woman standing in his kitchen, holding a future he had been too weak to protect. If this moment touched something in you, if you believe truth matters even when it arrives late, please take a second to like this video, share your thoughts in the comments right where you are watching, and subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice, truth, and the courage to face it. Your support helps these stories reach the people who need them most. "God," he breathed. "They told me you were gone. They said I died," Annie replied calmly, "and that my mom couldn't handle it. We were not." Jonathan closed his eyes. His jaw tightened, muscles flexing as if holding back something dangerous. "They showed me hospital papers," he said. "Doctors, dates, everything looked real." "They were real papers," Annie said. "Just not the real story." Jonathan opened his eyes again and stared at the folded document Annie had given him earlier. His signature stared back at him, confident and decisive, as if the man who had signed it believed he was doing the right thing. "I thought I was protecting you," he said hoarsely. "I thought I was choosing the lesser evil." Annie took a small step closer. "My mom said you were trying to be a good man in a bad place. That hurt more than accusation ever could have." Jonathan ran a hand through his hair, then pressed his fingers against his forehead. The room around them felt unreal now. Distant voices fading into nothing. All he could hear was his own breathing and the steady presence of the child in front of him. "Tell me about your mother," he said quietly. "Please." Annie's expression softened. "She's tired," she said. "But she's strong. She works a lot. She doesn't like asking for help." Jonathan nodded. He could picture her too, clearly bent over sinks, scrubbing floors that would never be hers, carrying dignity like armor. Why didn't she come to me? He asked again, the question raw now. Why didn't she tell me she was alive? Annie hesitated. She was afraid, she said. Not of you, of your family. She said they already proved they could erase people. Jonathan felt a cold weight settle in his chest. I should have fought harder, he whispered. I should have broken that agreement. She said you tried to find us, Annie replied. She said you asked questions, but you didn't know who was lying. Jonathan looked at her sharply. She knows I tried. She watched from far away, Annie said. Sometimes, Ested. The image hit him with brutal clarity. A woman standing at a distance, choosing survival over reunion, watching him move through a life built on absence. A soft knock interrupted the moment. Jonathan did not turn. Sir, his assistant said from the doorway, voice tense. The press is asking what's happening. Jonathan raised a hand without looking back. Give me time. When the door closed again, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. The necklace dangled from his fingers, swaying slightly, like a pendulum marking lost years. Annie, he said, if you are my daughter, then everything I believed about the last 6 years is wrong. I know, she said. That's why it's hard. And if this is true, he continued, there are people who will try to make it disappear again. Annie met his gaze. That's why I came myself. Jonathan straightened. In that moment, something shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, but decisively. The man who had spent his life avoiding scandal, avoiding conflict, felt a different instinct take hold. I'm going to verify everything, he said. Every record, every document. We'll do a DNA test. Annie nodded. My mom said you would, and if it's true, Jonathan added, his voice steady now, I'll find her. I won't let anyone hide her again. For the first time, Annie smiled, just a little. She'll be scared, she said. But she'll believe you. Jonathan stood and held out his hand. Annie looked at it for a moment, then placed her small hand in his. The contact was brief, careful, but it sent a shock through him that no courtroom victory ever had. As staff approached to guide Annie to a private room, Jonathan remained behind, staring down at the necklace in his palm. 6 years. 6 years stolen by silence, dressed up as protection. He closed his fingers around the chain and whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, I won't let them lie again, unquote. When the room finally emptied, Jonathan Hale was left alone with the truth and the knowledge that justice, once delayed, always demanded a price. The room Annie was taken to was small and quiet, the kind of place meant for sensitive conversations. A round table, 2 chairs, a box of tissues that had gone untouched for years. Jonathan stood outside for a moment after the door closed behind her, his hand hovering in the air as if he were unsure what to do with it. Then he turned away. Walking down the hallway, Jonathan felt the weight of the building differently than he ever had before. This place had hosted charity galas, press conferences, carefully curated moments of generosity. He had always felt in control here. Today, every step felt borrowed. His assistant caught up with him. Sir, the board is already calling. Social media is reacting. We need a statement. Not yet, Jonathan said. His voice was calm, but there was no room for negotiation. Cancel everything for the rest of the day. She hesitated. Everything? Yes. And when she left, Jonathan entered his private office and closed the door. For the first time in years, he locked it. He moved to the window and looked out over the city. Cars crawled along the streets below, people moving through their lives unaware that his had just split in two. He pressed the necklace against the glass, watching the reflection of the chain merge with his own face. 6 years ago, he had stood in a very different room. The memory came back without warning. The conference room at his family's estate had been too large, too cold. His father sat at the head of the table, his mother beside him, hands folded neatly as if this were a business meeting instead of an execution. The lawyer had spoken calmly, explaining terms, consequences, futures that could be saved or destroyed. You're young, his father had said. You'll recover. But not from this, Jonathan had argued. He remembered that clearly. He had raised his voice, slammed his fist on the table, insisted that love was not a scandal, that a child was not a mistake, and then they had shown him the numbers. The investors who would pull out, the partnerships that would dissolve, the headlines waiting to be written. He had thought of the woman he loved. He had thought of the child she was carrying, and in his fear, he had believed the lie that power offered him, that he could sacrifice himself quietly and still protect them. Jonathan sank into his chair now, the past pressing down on him with merciless clarity. "I failed you," he whispered, though neither Annie nor her mother could hear him. There was a knock at the door. "Yes," he said. His head of legal affairs stepped inside, expression carefully neutral. "Sir, I've been informed there's a situation." Jonathan gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit." The man obeyed. "I need every document related to a birth 6 years ago," Jonathan said. "Hospital records, NDAs, agreements signed by my family or their representatives." The lawyer frowned slightly. "That may take time. Some of those records, I don't care." Jonathan interrupted. "I want everything, including what I was never meant to see." A pause. "And the child?" the lawyer asked carefully. Jonathan's eyes hardened. "Her name is Annie." The lawyer nodded once. "Understood." When the door closed again, Jonathan leaned back and closed his eyes. His mind drifted, unwillingly, to Annie sitting alone in that small room. He imagined her swinging her legs slightly, hands folded just as they had been on the stage, waiting. The thought made his chest tighten. He stood abruptly and left the office, ignoring the startled looks from staff as he made his way back down the hallway. He stopped in front of the door to Annie's room and hesitated. "What do you say to a child you abandoned before she was born?" He knocked softly and entered. Annie looked up. She was sitting exactly as he had imagined. "They said you might be busy," she said. "I am," Jonathan replied. "But not too busy for you." She studied him for a moment, then nodded, as if accepting a decision she had already made. "I'm going to ask you something," Jonathan said, taking the chair across from her. "And I need you to be honest." "I will," Annie said. "Did your mother ever tell you to come here?" he asked. "To confront me like this?" Annie shook her head immediately. "No, she didn't want me to." Jonathan felt a flicker of something like relief. "Why not?" "She was afraid you wouldn't believe me," Annie said, "or that it would make things worse." "And what made you do it anyway?" Annie thought for a moment. "She's been getting weaker," she said quietly. "Not sick exactly, just tired. And I was scared that if I waited too long, you'd never know." Jonathan swallowed. "You shouldn't have had to carry that." Annie looked at him, serious again. Someone had to. There it was. The quiet burden children often carried when adults failed them. "I'm going to do a DNA test," Jonathan said, "as soon as possible." "I know," Annie replied. "My mom said you'd need proof, even if your heart already knows." Jonathan felt a sharp sting behind his eyes at her words. "And Annie," he added, "whatever happens next, I need you to understand something. None of this is your fault." She nodded slowly. "I know. My mom told me that too." He leaned back slightly, studying her face. He could see it now, not certainty, not proof, but resemblance. The way her brow furrowed when she concentrated. The way she listened more than she spoke. "Do you like school?" he asked suddenly. Annie blinked, surprised by the question. "Yes," she said. "I like reading." Jonathan smiled faintly. "So do I." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was cautious, tentative, but real. Outside the room, phones rang, messages stacked up, the world waited. Inside, a father and a daughter sat across from each other, connected by a truth that had survived 6 years of lies. Jonathan finally stood. "I need to take care of some things," he said, "but I'll come back." Annie looked up at him. "You promise?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "I promise." As he left the room, Jonathan understood something with painful clarity. Power could bury the truth. Money could delay it. But a child brave enough to speak could bring it all back to the surface. Jonathan did not return to his office after leaving Annie's room. Instead, he walked past it, down a quieter corridor that led to a smaller conference space rarely used anymore. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, breathing slowly, deliberately, as if reminding himself that this was real. He reached into his pocket and took out the necklace. The thin silver chain lay across his palm, catching the light from the ceiling. It looked fragile now, almost insignificant compared to the weight it carried. He rubbed his thumb along the clasp, a habit he had picked up years ago when thinking too much became unbearable. Annette had laughed when he bought it. He remembered that clearly. She had held it up, squinting at it, teasing him for spending money on something so ordinary when he could afford so much more. "It's not about the price," he had said. "It's about what it means. And now, 6 years later, meaning had come back to collect its debt. Jonathan sat down at the table and placed the necklace in front of him. He stared at it as if it might speak. "They told me you were dead," he murmured again, the words tasting bitter every time he said them. "They told me both of you were gone." He thought of the nights he had spent alone in penthouse apartments, staring out at city lights, convincing himself that grief was the price of ambition. That loss was unavoidable. That some lives simply collided with power and disappeared. He had been wrong. A knock broke the silence. "Yes," Jonathan said, more sharply than he intended. The head of legal affairs stepped in again, closing the door behind him. "We've started pulling records," he said. "Some of them are unusual." Jonathan did not look up. "Unusual how?" "Signed, authorizations that don't match hospital protocols. Witness signatures that repeat across different documents. It looks managed." Jonathan let out a short, humorless breath. "Of course it does. There's also a non-disclosure agreement," the lawyer continued, "between your family trust and the mother." Jonathan's head snapped up. "She signed it?" "Yes, under financial duress, most likely." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "And I was never told." "No," the lawyer said carefully. "You were told the matter was settled." Jonathan leaned back, closing his eyes. Settled. The word felt obscene now. "Schedule the DNA test," Jonathan said. "Immediately. We can have results expedited," the lawyer replied. "Given who you are." Jonathan opened his eyes. "No," he said firmly. "Given who she is." The lawyer paused, then nodded. "Understood." When he left, Jonathan remained seated, hands flat against the table. For the first time, anger began to burn through the shock, not loud, not explosive, but focused and cold. This had not been an accident. This had been a decision. He stood and walked back toward Annie's room, stopping just outside the door. He could hear her inside, talking softly to one of the staff members. Her voice sounded lighter now, less guarded. He did not go in. Instead, he leaned against the wall and let himself remember the search. After the funeral that never should have happened, he had asked questions, quiet ones at first, then louder ones. He had demanded reports, explanations, reassurances. Each time, his family had given him something to hold on to: documents, condolences, carefully worded statements that suggested closure while denying truth. Eventually, the questions had slowed. Work had filled the silence. Success had buried the doubt. Until today. Jonathan straightened and opened the door. Annie looked up immediately when he entered. Her shoulders relaxed just a little when she saw him. "I told them you'd come back," she said. "I said I would," Jonathan replied. He pulled a chair closer to hers this time. Not across the table, but beside it. The shift was subtle, intentional. "I need to ask you more questions," he said. "Not because I don't believe you, because I need to understand everything." Annie nodded. "Okay. Did your mother ever receive money from my family?" he asked. Annie frowned slightly. "Yes," she said. "Once. A long time ago. It didn't last." Jonathan felt a surge of anger tighten his chest. "Did they ever contact her again?" "No," Annie replied. "But she was scared they would." He nodded. "And you've never told anyone else about me?" Annie shook her head. "Just my mom." Jonathan studied her for a long moment. "That must have been hard." Annie shrugged, but her fingers twisted together. "I didn't want people to think I was making it up." Jonathan felt a familiar ache return, sharper now. He knew what it was like to have truth dismissed because it didn't fit expectations. Annie, he said quietly, there are people who will try to make you doubt yourself. She looked up at him. I won't. The certainty in her voice startled him. My mom says, Annie continued, that when the truth scares powerful people, it means it matters. Jonathan smiled faintly. She's right. He hesitated, then asked, would you like something to eat? Annie blinked, surprised. Yes, she said. I think so. What do you like? Grilled cheese, she answered after a moment. And apple slices. Jonathan nodded, committing it to memory as if it were the most important detail in the world. I'll make sure you get some, he said. And after that, we'll go together for the test. Annie's eyes searched his face. Together? Yes, Jonathan said. Whatever happens next, you won't do it alone. She nodded, once, firmly. As Jonathan stood, he felt the weight of the necklace still in his pocket, no longer a reminder of loss, but a marker of responsibility. Outside the room, the world waited to react. Inside, a truth long buried had begun to breathe again. And Jonathan Hale knew, with a certainty he had never felt in any boardroom, that the next steps would cost him dearly. But for the first time in 6 years, the cost felt worth paying. The clinic was quieter than Jonathan expected. It sat on the edge of the city, far from the glass towers and traffic noise, tucked behind a row of old oak trees whose branches brushed softly against the building in the afternoon breeze. Jonathan had chosen it deliberately, not because it was discreet, but because it was ordinary. No press, no executives, no family influence. Just a place where facts were supposed to matter more than names. Annie walked beside him as they entered, her hand wrapped loosely around his fingers. She had not let go since they left the building earlier. Jonathan noticed that she did not cling to him either. She held on the way someone does when they are afraid of falling, not of being left. You okay? He asked quietly. Annie nodded. I've never been to a place like this before. It's not scary, Jonathan said. Just a little uncomfortable. She considered that. I can handle uncomfortable. Is wide. He smiled despite himself. At the reception desk, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose looked up and offered a polite smile. Good afternoon. How can I help you? Jonathan gave his name. The woman's eyebrows lifted slightly, then smoothed. She had seen his face before, he was sure. But she said nothing more than, we're ready for you. They were led down a short hallway into a small examination room. White walls. A counter with sealed kits. 2 chairs, one clearly meant for an adult, the other sized for a child. Annie climbed onto the smaller chair without being asked. Jonathan watched her, struck again by how practiced she seemed at navigating unfamiliar spaces. Children her age were supposed to fidget, complain, ask questions. Annie sat still, her feet swinging slightly, eyes alert. This won't take long, the nurse said kindly. Just a swab from the inside of your cheek, both of you. Jonathan nodded. We're ready. 'Tis said. As the nurse prepared the kit, Jonathan found his gaze drifting to Annie's reflection in the small mirror above the sink. For a fleeting moment, he saw not the child in front of him, but the infant he had never held. The baby he had mourned without ever knowing. You can look at me, he said softly to Annie. It might help. She did. Their eyes met, and something passed between them, trust. Fragile and tentative, but real. When it was done, the nurse sealed the samples with careful precision. Results should be ready within 48 hours, she said. We'll call you directly. Jonathan thanked her. As they stood to leave, Annie looked up at him. What happens now? She asked. Jonathan paused. The truth was, there were 100 things happening now. Lawyers, records, conversations that would fracture families and reputations. But none of that was for her. Now, he said, we wait, and we eat that grilled cheese I promised you. Annie smiled. This time, it reached her eyes. They went to a small diner not far from the clinic, the kind that smelled like coffee and butter no matter the hour. Jonathan ordered for both of them, watching Annie carefully as she ate, the way she folded her napkin, the way she took small, deliberate bites, as if she did not expect the food to last. You don't have to hurry, he said gently. I know, she replied. "I just like to be careful. I might take it. Careful." Another word that felt too heavy for a 6-year-old. As she ate, Jonathan's phone buzzed repeatedly on the table. He ignored it. For once, the world could wait. "Can I ask you something?" Annie said after a moment. "Of course. Did you ever stop thinking about us?" she asked. Jonathan did not answer right away. He stared into his coffee, watching the steam rise and disappear. "No," he said finally. "I told myself I did, but I didn't." Annie nodded, as if that confirmed something she had already known. "My mom says," she said, "that people don't forget what they truly love. They just learn how to live with the pain." Jonathan felt his throat tighten. "Your mother is very wise." "She had to be," Annie said simply. After they finished eating, Jonathan drove them back to the building, this time to a private residence he rarely used. It was quieter there, safer. Annie explored the living room with cautious curiosity, touching the edge of a bookshelf, peering out the window. "This place is big," she said. "It is," Jonathan agreed. "Too big. Sometimes. Does it feel lonely?" Annie asked. Jonathan considered the question. "It did," he said. "It doesn't right now." Annie nodded, satisfied. That evening, after arranging for a trusted caretaker to stay nearby, Jonathan stepped into his study and finally answered his phone. The calls came in waves: board members, advisors, his mother. He ignored the first few. Then, when the phone rang again, he saw her name and felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. He answered. "What is going on?" his mother demanded. "Do you have any idea what you've done today?" Jonathan closed his eyes. "I found my daughter." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end, then silence. "That child," she said carefully, "is confused." "No," Jonathan replied. "She's brave. You're letting emotions cloud your judgment." "I've let fear guide it for too long," he said. "That ends now. This will destroy everything we built," she warned. Jonathan looked toward the hallway, where he could hear Annie's soft footsteps as she moved around the room, exploring a world she had never been allowed to enter. "Then it deserves to be destroyed," he said quietly. He ended the call. Later that night, Jonathan sat alone in the dark, the necklace resting on the desk in front of him. He thought of the test results still days away, of the storm that would follow regardless of what they said. But for the first time, uncertainty did not feel paralyzing. It felt honest. In the other room, Annie slept peacefully, unaware of the battles ahead. Jonathan watched the door, keeping silent guard. 6 years ago, he had signed away his right to be a father. Now, he was preparing to earn it back. Jonathan did not sleep. He lay awake in the guest room across the hall from Annie's, staring at the ceiling as the city outside settled into its late-night rhythm. Somewhere below, a siren wailed and faded. The sound reminded him that life went on, indifferent to revelations, unmoved by guilt. Every few minutes, he rose quietly and walked to Annie's door. She slept on her side, one hand tucked under her cheek, her breathing slow and even. The sight of it tightened something deep in his chest. For 6 years, he had imagined a grave, a stone, a finality. Now here she was alive, warm, real, and afraid, even in sleep. Jonathan returned to the living room and sat down heavily on the couch. The necklace lay on the coffee table where he had placed it earlier. He picked it up again, letting the chain slide through his fingers. "How did I let them do this?" he whispered. The question had no answer, only echoes. At dawn, his phone vibrated softly. He looked at the screen, half expecting the clinic. Instead, it was his head of security. "Sir," the man said when Jonathan answered, voice low and urgent. "Your family is aware Annie is with you." Jonathan closed his eyes. "How?" "Staff," someone talked. "They're asking to see you." "No," Jonathan said immediately. "They don't come here." "Understood," the man replied. "But they won't stop." Jonathan ended the call and sat still for a moment, absorbing the truth of it. The silence he had once accepted as protection had been a weapon. Now that it was broken, the consequences would come quickly. Annie appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Are you mad?" she asked softly. Jonathan stood at once. "No," he said. "Why would you think that?" You were talking, she replied. Sometimes grown-ups only talk to themselves when they're upset. He knelt in front of her, bringing himself level with her eyes. I'm not mad at you, he said. I'm mad at myself. Teppity's so. Annie considered this. My mom says being mad at yourself means you still care. Jonathan nodded. She's right. They had breakfast together, toast, fruit, and milk. Simple things. Jonathan noticed Annie eat more slowly today, watching him between bites, as if checking whether he was still there. Are you going to send me away? She asked suddenly. The question hit him like a physical blow. No, he said at once. Why would you think that? People usually do, Annie replied. When things get complicated. Jonathan reached across the table and gently touched her hand. She froze for a fraction of a second, then relaxed. I won't, he said. Not now. Not ever. She nodded, accepting the promise the way a child accepts gravity, not because it is guaranteed, but because it is necessary. Later that morning, Jonathan made the calls he had avoided for years. Hospitals, lawyers, old contacts who had once answered only to his family. This time, he spoke differently, not as a son seeking reassurance, but as a man demanding accountability. Patterns began to emerge. Records altered. Timelines adjusted. Witnesses who remembered things differently when pressed. By noon, the truth was no longer a suspicion. It was a structure, ugly, deliberate, carefully maintained. Jonathan returned to the living room where Annie sat coloring at the table. She had chosen a blue crayon and was drawing something with careful focus. What is it? He asked. Our house, Annie replied without looking up. The one we don't have yet. Jonathan swallowed. It's beautiful, he said. Even though it was only lines and shapes, she looked up at him. Are you going to be okay? The question startled him. Adults were not usually asked such things by children. I don't know, he admitted, but I'll try. Annie nodded. That's what my mom always says. In the afternoon, Jonathan received another call, this time from the clinic. We've expedited the analysis, the voice on the line said. Preliminary results will be ready tomorrow morning. Tomorrow, Jonathan thanked them and hung up, his heart pounding. Tomorrow would change everything, regardless of the outcome. He looked at Annie, who was now sitting on the floor, lining up her crayons by color. Tomorrow, he said aloud. Annie looked up. That's when we find out, right? Yes. Aye. She nodded, then asked, what if people get angry? They might, Jonathan said honestly. What if they don't believe it? Some won't, he admitted. Annie thought for a moment. That's okay, she said. You believe me. Jonathan felt something shift inside him. Yes, he said. I do. As evening fell, Jonathan received a final call. This one from his father. Come home, the older man said. We need to talk. 10 and 2. Jonathan looked at Annie, who was curled up on the couch watching a cartoon, her laughter soft and unguarded. No, Jonathan replied. We don't. This is getting out of hand. His father warned. You're risking everything. Jonathan's voice was calm. I already did. 6 years ago. He ended the call without waiting for a response. That night, Jonathan sat beside Annie as she fell asleep on the couch, too tired to make it back to the bedroom. He covered her with a blanket and watched her chest rise and fall. For the first time since she had spoken his name on that stage, he allowed himself to imagine a future that was not defined by damage control or public perception. Just truth, just responsibility, just a child who had trusted him enough to come forward when no one else would. Jonathan leaned back and closed his eyes, the weight of the coming storm pressing down on him. Tomorrow would bring proof. After that would come consequences. But tonight, in the quiet before everything changed, he stayed awake and kept watch. Morning arrived without ceremony. Jonathan was already awake when the sun pushed a thin line of light through the curtains. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink, staring at his phone as if it might speak before it rang. Every minute stretched longer than the last. Time, he realized, did not move differently during moments like these. It only felt crueler. From the hallway came the soft sound of footsteps. Annie appeared, rubbing her eyes, her hair slightly tangled. She stood there for a moment, unsure, then walked toward him. Is it today? she asked. Jonathan nodded. Yes. She climbed onto the chair across from him, pulling her knees up and wrapping her arms around them. For a child waiting on the answer to a question that could rewrite her life, she was unnervingly calm. You don't have to be brave all the time, Jonathan said gently. Annie looked at him. I know, but it helps. I was great. Before he could respond, the phone rang. Jonathan froze. His fingers hovered over the screen for half a second too long before he answered. Yes, he said. The voice on the other end was professional, measured. Jonathan listened without interrupting, his grip tightening around the phone as each word landed. Confirmed. Match. No ambiguity. He closed his eyes. Thank you, he said when it was over. His voice barely steady enough to pass as calm. He ended the call and set the phone down slowly, as if sudden movement might shatter something fragile in the air. Annie watched him closely. You're holding your breath, she said. Jonathan exhaled, a long, uneven breath that felt like it had been trapped in his chest for 6 years. It's true, he said. You're my daughter. Annie did not smile. She did not cry. She simply nodded once, as if a final piece had clicked into place. I knew, she said. Jonathan stood abruptly and turned away, pressing his hands against the counter. The weight of the moment crashed over him in waves, relief, guilt, rage, love, all colliding without order or mercy. I should have protected you, he said, his voice breaking despite his effort to control it. I should have been there. Annie slid off her chair and walked over to him. She stopped just short of touching him. My mom says, she said quietly, that you can't fix yesterday, only today. It is dental. Jonathan turned back to her, eyes red. She's right. The phone rang again almost immediately. This time, Jonathan did not hesitate. The calls came quickly after that. Lawyers confirming what he already knew. Advisors warning him about exposure. Board members urging caution, discretion, delay. Jonathan listened to each one, thanked them, then ended the calls without committing to anything. When his mother called, he let it ring. Annie watched him set the phone face down. Is she mad? Yes, Jonathan replied. Annie considered this. Will she stop being mad? I don't know, he said honestly. But I can't let that decide what's right. There was a knock at the door. Jonathan stiffened instinctively, then relaxed when his head of security stepped inside. Sir, the man said, your family's legal team is requesting an immediate meeting. Jonathan shook his head. Not today. They're insisting. Let them insist, Jonathan said. Today is for my daughter. Annie looked up at him. I like how that sounds. Jonathan smiled faintly. Me too. He knelt in front of her. There's something important we need to do next, he said. We need to find your mother. Annie's expression changed instantly. The calm cracked, just slightly, revealing worry underneath. She'll be scared, Annie said. She won't believe it's safe. Jonathan nodded. Then we'll show her. They spent the rest of the morning planning quietly. Jonathan made calls to locate an address Annie remembered only vaguely. Each detail mattered now, every bus stop, every job, every place where someone might disappear without leaving a trace. By afternoon, they had a lead. Jonathan drove himself. No driver, no convoy. Just the two of them in a quiet car moving through streets that grew less polished with every mile. Do you come here often? Annie asked as the buildings changed. No, Jonathan admitted. My mom does, Annie said. People here don't ask many questions. Jonathan felt the familiar burn of shame rise again. They stopped in front of a small apartment building, its paint peeling, its steps worn smooth by years of use. Annie hesitated before opening the door. What if she says no? She asked softly. Jonathan crouched beside her. Then we wait. We don't force anything. Annie nodded and pushed the door open. They climbed the stairs slowly. On the 3rd floor, Annie stopped and pointed. That one, Deji Self. Jonathan knocked. There was a long pause, then the sound of movement. The door opened just a crack. Annette's eyes widened when she saw Annie. Then they shifted to Jonathan. Shock, fear, recognition. You shouldn't be here, she said immediately, her voice low and strained. I know, Jonathan replied. But we need to talk. Annette shook her head. It's too late. No, Jonathan said. It's 6 years late. Silence stretched between them. Annie stepped forward and took her mother's hand. It's okay, Annie said. He knows now. Annette's gaze flicked back to Jonathan. You did a test? Jonathan nodded. She's my daughter. Annette closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging as if something she had been holding up for years had finally been set down. They promised me you'd never know, she whispered. Jonathan felt the weight of her words settle heavily between them. They lied, he said. Annette opened the door wider. Inside the small apartment, sunlight filtered through thin curtains. It was modest, clean, lived in. Evidence of a life built quietly, carefully, under the shadow of fear. Jonathan stepped inside and stopped, unsure. I'm not here to take anything away, he said. I'm here to take responsibility. Annette studied his face for a long moment, searching for something. Power doesn't make truth safer, she said. No, Jonathan agreed. But I won't use it to hide anymore. Annie stood between them, holding both their hands now. For the first time, the three of them were in the same room, not as a secret, not as a mistake, but as a family broken by lies and standing, finally, in the open. The apartment smelled faintly of soap and cooked rice, a comforting scent that spoke of routine rather than comfort. Jonathan stood just inside the doorway, aware of how much space he occupied, how his presence changed the air in the room. Annette closed the door behind them slowly, as if sealing off the past with a careful hand. Annie let go of Jonathan first and moved toward the small couch by the window. She sat down quietly, folding her hands in her lap, eyes flicking between her parents. This was not a reunion she needed to narrate. She had already done the hardest part by bringing them together. Annette remained standing, arms crossed, her posture defensive but tired. Up close, Jonathan could see the lines at the corners of her eyes, the faint tension in her jaw. She looked thinner than he remembered, but there was a steadiness in her gaze that had not been there before. You shouldn't have come yourself, Annette said at last. They won't like this. Jonathan nodded. I didn't come as their son. That's easy to say now, she replied. You have power now. Jonathan felt the accusation land, sharp but fair. I didn't have enough when it mattered, he said. I know that. Annette laughed softly, without humor. They told me you agreed, that you understood why this had to happen. I was told you would be protected, Jonathan said, that Annie would be safe. Annette's eyes flashed. Safe? She repeated. They gave me money once, and a paper that said I wasn't allowed to speak. Then they disappeared. Jonathan looked down at his hands. I didn't know. I know, she said quietly. That's what made it worse. The silence stretched. Outside, a car passed, music muffled through closed windows. Life, unbothered. Jonathan took a step forward, then stopped. I'm not here to rewrite what happened, he said. I can't. I'm here to ask what you need now. Annette studied him carefully. And if what I need costs you. Jonathan met her gaze. Then I pay it. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her shoulders easing just a fraction. They'll come after me, she said. They always do. They won't, Jonathan replied. Not without going through me. Annette shook her head. You don't know how they work. I do, Jonathan said. I grew up inside it. That earned a pause. Annie shifted on the couch. Mom, she said softly. You said he would listen if he knew. Yes. Annette turned to her daughter, her expression softening immediately. She walked over and knelt in front of her, brushing a curl away from Annie's forehead. I said he might, she corrected gently. Jonathan watched the exchange, feeling both like an intruder and an essential piece all at once. I listened, he said, and I'm still here. Annette stood again, her gaze returning to him. What happens now? She asked. Jonathan took a breath. Now, we slow down. No press. No announcements. I'll handle my family. You focus on Annie. And you? Annette asked. Jonathan hesitated. I focus on being present. Annie looked up. Does that mean you'll come back? Yes, Jonathan said without hesitation. If you'll let me. Annette searched his face for a long moment. Whatever she was looking for, She seemed to find enough of it. You can visit, she said finally. But on our terms, Jonathan nodded. Of course, the relief that crossed Annie's face was small but unmistakable. They talked quietly after that. About school. About Annie's favorite books. About the places Annette worked and the neighbors who watched out for each other. Jonathan listened more than he spoke, absorbing a life that had existed without him, shaped by absence but not defined by it. As evening approached, Jonathan stood to leave. He did not want to overstay, did not want to turn this fragile beginning into another intrusion. I'll come back tomorrow, he said. Annette nodded. We'll be here. At the door, Jonathan paused. Annette, he said. I'm sorry. She looked at him steadily. I know, she said. Just don't make me say it again. He nodded once and left. In the car, Jonathan sat for a long moment before starting the engine. His phone buzzed with messages he still hadn't answered. They could wait. For the first time, he knew where he was going. Jonathan returned the next morning alone. He parked across the street this time, sitting in the car longer than necessary, watching the front of the apartment building as if it might reject him outright. The place looked different in daylight, less hidden, more exposed. He wondered how many times Annette had looked out these same windows, calculating risk, weighing silence against survival. When he finally stepped out of the car, he carried nothing but himself. No assistance, no security, just a paper bag from a nearby bakery, the top folded down carefully. Annie opened the door before he could knock. You came, she said, a quiet certainty in her voice. I said I would, Jonathan replied. She stepped aside to let him in. Annette stood near the kitchen, arms crossed again, though her posture was less rigid than the night before. You didn't bring an audience, she said. Jonathan held up the bag. Just breakfast. That earned a small pause. Annette nodded toward the table. Put it there. They ate together in near silence. Annie broke off pieces of her pastry and lined them neatly on her napkin before eating them one by one. Jonathan noticed the habit and wondered what it said about a childhood shaped by caution. After breakfast, Annette poured coffee into a chipped mug and leaned against the counter. You said you'd handle your family, she said. What does that mean? Exactly. Jonathan met her gaze. It means they don't get to decide what happens next. Dabute. And if they don't accept that, they'll have to learn, he replied. Annette let out a slow breath. They're not used to being told no. I know, Jonathan said. Neither was I. The honesty surprised both of them. Annie looked up from her coloring book. Are they mad? She asked. Yes, Jonathan answered. Very. Annie nodded, as if that settled something. My mom says mad people sometimes tell the truth by accident. Jonathan smiled faintly. She's wise. The phone in his pocket vibrated. Jonathan ignored it. Annette noticed. That won't stop, she said. No, Jonathan agreed. But it can wait. They spent the morning quietly. Annie showed him her school books, her careful handwriting, the way she underlined words she wanted to remember. Jonathan listened as she read aloud, her voice steady, her confidence growing with each sentence. You're good at this, he said. Annie shrugged. Reading doesn't yell at you. Jonathan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He recognized the instinct to find safety in something that could not hurt you. At midday, his phone vibrated again. This time, he stepped into the hallway to answer. What are you thinking? His father demanded the moment the line connected. You've humiliated us. Jonathan closed his eyes. You humiliated yourselves. This is bigger than you, his father said. You're risking the company. I'm protecting my child. A sharp laugh. That girl. Don't. Jonathan cut in. His voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it now. If you say another word about her, this conversation is over. Silence followed. You signed the agreement, his father said finally. Yes, Jonathan replied. Under pressure. And it doesn't erase blood. You think the public will forgive this? Jonathan looked back toward the apartment, where Annie's laughter floated softly through the open door. I'm not asking them to. He ended the call. When he returned inside, Annette was watching him closely. That was them, she said. Yes. And? Jonathan took a breath. They won't stop. Not right away. Annette nodded. I didn't expect them to. Annie stood up and walked over to him. Are we in trouble? Jonathan crouched to meet her eye level. No, he said firmly. We're in the middle of something important. Annie considered this. Important things are usually scary, she said. Yes, Jonathan replied, but they're worth it. End quote. In the afternoon, Jonathan made arrangements quietly. Legal protections, temporary housing options, should Annette want them, counseling resources, schools Annie could attend without being uprooted. He did not present them as solutions. He presented them as choices. Annette listened, asked questions, pushed back when something felt wrong. Jonathan accepted it without argument. This was not a negotiation to win. As evening approached, Annette stood at the window, looking out at the street. They'll try to spin this, she said. Make it look like charity. Or confusion. I won't let them, Jonathan said. And if they do? Jonathan's answer came without hesitation. Then I'll tell the truth louder. She turned to him. That will cost you. I know. Annie climbed onto the couch and curled up with a book. Jonathan watched her for a moment, then spoke quietly. I won't move her. I won't change her life without your consent. Annette studied him, searching for old patterns, old weakness. You've changed, she said. Jonathan nodded. I had to. That night, as he prepared to leave again, Annie walked him to the door. You're coming back tomorrow too? She asked. Yes, Jonathan said. And the day after that? She nodded, satisfied. As Jonathan stepped into the hallway, he paused. Annie, he said. She looked up. I'm proud of you. She smiled, not small this time, but wide and unguarded. In the car, Jonathan sat with his hands on the steering wheel, feeling the familiar pull of responsibility take on a new shape. This was not about fixing the past. It was about standing still long enough to let the truth catch up. Behind him, in a modest apartment that had survived years of fear, a child slept, knowing her father was no longer a secret. And for the first time, Jonathan Hale understood that power meant nothing if it could not protect the smallest voice in the room. The pressure did not arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, through polite emails and carefully worded phone calls, through familiar names that suddenly sounded distant and formal. Jonathan felt it the moment he walked into his office the following morning. People avoided his eyes. He closed the door behind him and stood there for a moment, grounding himself. The city stretched out beyond the windows, unchanged, indifferent. For years, this view had steadied him. Today, it felt like a reminder of how high he could fall. His assistant followed him in, tablet pressed against her chest. The board has requested an emergency meeting, she said. They'd like it today. Jonathan nodded. Schedule it. She hesitated. They're concerned about optics. Jonathan almost smiled. Of course they are. When she left, Jonathan sat down and opened the file his legal team had compiled overnight. Pages of timelines, signatures, witness statements, patterns that no longer looked accidental when placed side by side. The truth was no longer just emotional. It was documented. Still, documentation did not equal justice. The meeting began at noon. Faces filled the screen, men and women Jonathan had known for years. Some who had mentored him, others who had quietly benefited from his rise. We need to talk about damage control, one of them began. No, Jonathan replied calmly. We need to talk about accountability. A pause followed. This situation is complex, another voice said carefully. A child making claims. She's not making claims, Jonathan interrupted. She's my daughter. That hasn't been publicly confirmed, someone else pointed out. Jonathan leaned forward. It will be. The room shifted. He could feel it, the collective recalculation. This could destabilize investor confidence, the first speaker warned. Your family's involvement. My family's involvement is the problem, Jonathan said, and I won't protect it anymore. Silence followed. Not agreement. Recognition. When the meeting ended, Jonathan did not feel relief. He felt clarity. He left the office early and drove back toward Annette's neighborhood. The streets grew narrower, the buildings older. This part of the city did not pretend to be something it wasn't. Annie was sitting on the front steps when he arrived, a book open in her lap. "You're early," she said. "I needed to see you," Jonathan replied. She scooted over to make room. He sat beside her, feeling the rough concrete through his suit trousers. "Are things bad?" she asked. "They're uncomfortable," Jonathan said. "For people who don't like the truth." Annie nodded. "That usually means you're doing it right." Jonathan laughed softly. "You sound like your mother. She says I pay attention," Annie replied. Inside, Annette watched them through the window before opening the door. "You look tired," she said to Jonathan. "I am,"
You look tired.
he admitted. "Good," she replied. "It means you're not running." They sat at the small table again. Annette poured coffee. Annie colored quietly nearby, humming under her breath. "They've started calling," Annette said. "People I don't know, asking questions." Jonathan nodded. "They'll keep trying. To intimidate. To reframe. I won't talk to them," Annette said firmly. "I don't want you to," Jonathan replied. "If anything happens, you call me." She studied him. "You're serious?" I am." Annie looked up suddenly. "Are they trying to take me away?" Jonathan turned to her immediately. "No," he said. "No one is taking you anywhere." "Ever?" she asked. Jonathan held her gaze. "Not without your mother's say. Not without mine." Annie seemed to accept that, returning to her coloring. Later that afternoon, Jonathan received a message he had been expecting and dreading. A formal request from his family's legal counsel, asking Annette to attend a private mediation. Annette read it twice, then set the phone down.
They want me alone.
"They want me alone." Jonathan shook his head. "You don't go. They'll say I'm unreasonable," she said. "Let them," Jonathan replied. "Reasonableness has been their weapon." Annette exhaled slowly. "You know this won't end quietly." "I know," Jonathan said. "That's why it needs to be honest." That evening, Jonathan stayed longer than usual. He helped Annie with her homework, listening as she sounded out words, correcting herself when she stumbled. The patience in her voice surprised him. "You don't get frustrated," he observed. Annie shrugged. "Getting mad doesn't help the word read itself." Jonathan smiled. Another small lesson, offered without knowing. As the sky darkened, Jonathan prepared to leave. At the door, Annie hesitated. "Are you scared?" she asked. Jonathan considered the question. "Yes," he said. "But not of losing things anymore." Annie nodded. "My mom says when you stop being afraid of losing things, you start protecting people." Jonathan felt the truth of it settle deep in his chest. On the drive home, his phone buzzed with a message from his mother. A single sentence, "You're tearing this family apart." Jonathan did not reply. Instead, he thought of Annie on the steps, of Annette at the table, of a life that had survived without him and still made room for him. The next day would bring escalation, statements, leaks, pressure, but tonight he let himself hold on to something quieter and stronger than reputation. Resolve. The leak came the next morning. Jonathan knew it the moment his phone began to vibrate before sunrise, the screen lighting up again and again with messages he did not open. He lay still for a few seconds, listening to the city outside his window, feeling the familiar tightening in his chest. This was the part his family had always been good at, moving first, quietly, forcing everyone else to react. By the time he arrived at his office, it was already everywhere. Speculation framed as concern, sympathy carefully balanced with doubt, anonymous sources close to the family suggesting confusion, misinterpretation, emotional instability. The language was clean, professional, and deeply calculated. Jonathan read it all without expression. They weren't denying Annie existed. That would have been too easy to disprove. Instead, they questioned context, motive, timing. They planted just enough uncertainty to make the truth feel negotiable. His assistant hovered at the door. "They're requesting another board call," she said. Immediately, Jonathan nodded. "Set it up." The faces appeared on the screen once more guarded now, more distant. "You've lost control of the narrative," one of them said. "I never had it," Jonathan replied. "I just stopped letting you borrow it." "This is becoming a reputational risk," another warned. "Your family's name is tied to this company whether you like it or not." Jonathan leaned forward. "Not anymore. Ideas." That got their attention. "What are you saying?" someone asked. I'm saying the truth isn't a strategy, Jonathan said. It's a line. I've chosen which side I'm on. Silence followed. This time, it wasn't calculated. It was unsettled. After the call, Jonathan did not stay to argue. He gathered the documents he needed, shut down his computer, and left. There were battles ahead, but none of them required him to sit in that room. He drove straight to Annette's apartment. She answered the door with a tight expression, phone in hand. They've started calling my job, she said. Not threatening, just asking. Jonathan nodded. That's how they test boundaries. Annie sat at the table, drawing quietly, but her eyes flicked up the moment he entered. They're being mean, she said. Yes, Jonathan replied. They are. Is it because of me? She asked. Jonathan crossed the room and knelt in front of her. No, he said firmly. It's because of what they did. You're just the reason they can't hide anymore. Annie studied his face. So, I didn't break anything? No, Jonathan said. You revealed it. That seemed to settle something in her. Annette folded her arms. They want to meet, she said. All of us. Mediation. Behind closed doors. Jonathan shook his head. That's not mediation. That's containment. And if we refuse? Annette asked. Then they escalate, Jonathan replied. Publicly. Annette looked toward Annie, then back at Jonathan. I won't let them paint her as a problem. Neither will I, Jonathan said. That's why we don't go quietly. He reached into his bag and pulled out a folder, placing it on the table. These are the documents, he said. The agreement, the hospital records, the inconsistencies. Annette opened it slowly, flipping through the pages. Her hands trembled slightly, but she did not stop. They built this to protect themselves, Jonathan continued. But it also proves intent. Annette looked up. You're going to expose them. Yes, that will destroy your relationship with them, she said. Jonathan did not hesitate. They destroyed it first. Annie stood and walked over, resting her hand on the edge of the table. Does this mean people will talk about us on TV? Yes, Jonathan admitted. Annie frowned. I don't like that. I know, he said gently. We'll protect you as much as we can. How? She asked. By telling the truth once, Jonathan replied. So it doesn't have to be explained 1,000 times. That afternoon, Jonathan met with an independent attorney, one with no ties to his family. They spoke plainly about consequences, about retaliation, about how power rarely surrendered without trying to take something with it. Jonathan listened, then nodded. Proceed. When he returned to the apartment, Annie was curled up on the couch beside Annette, half asleep. Jonathan watched them for a moment before speaking. They're going to make this ugly, he said quietly. Annette met his gaze. It's been ugly for 6 years, Jonathan exhaled. I'm going to issue a statement. Not defensive, not emotional, just factual. Annette nodded. That's all I ever wanted. As evening fell, Jonathan typed the words himself. No consultants, no filters. I was misled. My daughter was hidden from me. That ends now. He read it once, then sent it. The reaction was immediate. Support, outrage, denial, praise, threats. Jonathan turned off his phone. He sat with Annette and Annie as the sky darkened, the room lit by a single lamp. Annie leaned against him without asking, her head resting lightly against his arm. You're shaking, she observed. Jonathan smiled faintly. A little. That's okay, Annie said. It means you're doing something hard. He closed his eyes briefly, letting her words steady him. Outside, the world reacted. Inside, something fragile but real held its ground. For the first time since this began, Jonathan understood that the fight ahead was not about clearing his name. It was about refusing to let a child be erased again. The fallout was louder than Jonathan expected. It wasn't just headlines or opinion pieces. It was the sudden invasion of his private life by strangers who believed proximity to the truth entitled them to judgment. Reporters gathered outside the apartment building by noon, their cameras angled upward, waiting for a glimpse of a child who had already been forced into the open once. Jonathan arrived just after lunchtime and immediately felt the shift in the air. Annette met him at the door, her face tight with contained anger. They followed Annie home from school, she said quietly.
They didn't say a word.
Didn't talk to her,
They just stared.
just watched.
No
Jonathan
words,
felt
just
something
eyes
cold
watching
settle in
the
his
entire
stomach.
time.
That stops today. Inside,
Hey there.
Annie sat at the table,
You don't have to
her
talk if you don't
backpack
want
still
to. I
on,
just want to make sure you're safe.
her shoes neatly lined by the door. She looked up when Jonathan entered. They asked my teacher questions, she said matter-of-factly. Jonathan crouched in front of her. Did they talk to you? No, Annie replied. My teacher told them to leave. Jonathan nodded, grateful. You did nothing wrong. I know, Annie said. But I don't like being looked at like a story. Neither did he. That afternoon, Jonathan made arrangements quickly. Not dramatic ones, practical ones. Temporary relocation to a quieter place, school accommodations, a driver who understood discretion rather than spectacle. Annette listened as he explained it all, arms crossed, weighing each suggestion. I don't want to run, she said. I'm not asking you to, Jonathan replied. I'm asking you to breathe. She studied him for a long moment.
I'm trying to learn.
You're learning, she said finally. I have to, Jonathan answered. Annie tugged gently at Annette's sleeve. Can we go somewhere with trees? She asked. Just for a little while. Annette's expression softened. Yes, she said.
Understood.
We can.
Thank you.
Very day. By evening, they were on the road, heading out of the city. The noise fell away mile by mile, replaced by long stretches of quiet highway and open sky. Annie pressed her forehead to the window, watching the buildings disappear. This is nicer, she said. Jonathan nodded. It is. They arrived at a small house Jonathan had once bought and never used, tucked near a state park. It wasn't luxurious. It was private. That was what mattered now. As night settled in, Annette stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself. Jonathan joined her, the sound of crickets filling the space between them. They won't stop, she said. I know, Jonathan replied. But they won't control this either. She glanced at him. You're really willing to lose everything for her. Jonathan didn't answer immediately. He thought of boardrooms, of influence, of the carefully constructed life he had built. Then he thought of Annie sitting at the table earlier, small and steady, refusing to be ashamed. I already lost everything once,
It's okay.
he
You can
said.
relax now.
I just didn't realize it at the time. Inside, Annie was unpacking her bag, lining up her books on a shelf she had chosen herself. When Jonathan stepped in, she looked up. Is this where we hide? She asked. Jonathan shook his head.
This is where they rest.
No, he said. This is where we rest. She seemed to like that answer. Later that night,
We can't do
Jonathan's
this right now.
phone rang again. This time, it was his mother. You've humiliated us, she said without greeting. Jonathan closed his eyes.
Yes, Mother.
You humiliated a child. You're being dramatic, she replied. This will pass if you stop feeding it. I'm not feeding it, Jonathan said. I'm ending it. You think the public will side with you? She asked. I don't care, Jonathan replied. I care about my daughter. A sharp breath on the other end.
He is not your responsibility.
She's not your responsibility,
Come home.
his mother said coldly. Jonathan's voice hardened. She is the only one I'm responsible for. He ended the call. When he returned to the living room, Annie was asleep on the couch, a book resting on her chest. Annette sat nearby, watching her. She's strong, Annette said quietly. She shouldn't have to be, Jonathan replied. Annette nodded. No, she shouldn't. Jonathan sat down and let the silence settle. Outside, the trees swayed gently, indifferent to human conflict. For the first time since the story broke, the world felt distant enough to breathe. Tomorrow would bring new attacks, new narratives, attempts to twist truth into something manageable. But tonight, in a quiet house, surrounded by trees, Jonathan understood something clearly. Power could shout, money could threaten, but a child who refused to disappear had already won the most important battle. The morning news found them anyway. Jonathan woke before sunrise, the quiet house still wrapped in shadow. For a few seconds, he forgot where he was. Then the weight of the last week settled back onto his chest, familiar now, almost steadying. He rose quietly and stepped into the kitchen, careful not to wake anyone. The television flickered to life at low volume. His face filled the screen. The anchor's voice was calm, practiced, almost gentle as she spoke about a complicated family matter and questions surrounding a powerful dynasty. Jonathan listened without expression, coffee cooling untouched in his hands. They were no longer pretending this was a misunderstanding. Now, it was a debate. Behind him, the floor creaked softly. Annette stood in the doorway, robe pulled tight around her, eyes already tired. She did not need to ask what was on the screen. They're framing it, she said. Yes, Jonathan replied. They always do. They're not calling it what it is, she continued. They're calling it a controversy. Jonathan nodded. Controversy sounds optional. Truth doesn't. Annette poured herself coffee and sat across from him. What happens when they start digging into my past? They already are, Jonathan said. That's why we get ahead of it. She studied him carefully. You're sure you want to do this today? Jonathan did not hesitate. Yes. Inside the living room, Annie stirred on the couch. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes. Are they still talking about us? She asked. Jonathan muted the television. Yes. Annie frowned. I don't like the way they say your name. It sounds angry. Jonathan set his cup down and knelt in front of her. They're not angry at me, he said. They're afraid of losing control. Can they make us go away? Annie asked. No, Jonathan replied. Not anymore. Annie nodded, but her fingers twisted together. Annette noticed and crossed the room, sitting beside her daughter. You don't have to watch any of it, Annette said softly. This isn't for you. Annie leaned into her. I know, but I want to know what's happening. Jonathan felt a familiar ache return. Children should not have to decide when to be informed about attacks on their existence. By mid-morning, Jonathan's independent attorney arrived. No small talk, no reassurance, just facts. They're pushing for mediation again, he said. Privately. They want you to retract your statement. Jonathan shook his head. I won't. They're also floating the idea that Annette violated the agreement, the attorney continued. They may try to sue. Annette stiffened. For what? For speaking, the attorney replied. Jonathan's jaw tightened. That agreement was signed under coercion. Yes, the attorney said, and we can prove it, but they're counting on fear. Jonathan stood. Then we stop letting fear speak. He turned to Annette. I want you with me today. Her eyes widened slightly. Where? A press conference, Jonathan said. Not a spectacle, just the truth, from both of us. Annette hesitated. Years of survival had taught her that visibility came with cost. I won't let them turn me into a symbol, she said quietly. Or her. They won't, Jonathan replied. You'll speak only what you choose, and if at any moment you want to stop, we stop. Annette looked at Annie. I'll stay here, Annie said quickly. With the trees, Annette knelt and held her daughter's face. We'll be back, she promised. Annie searched her mother's eyes, then Jonathan's. Tell the truth, she said. The real one. Jonathan nodded. That's the only one we have. The drive back into the city felt heavier than the first time. News vans lined the street outside the building where the conference would be held. Jonathan parked away from the cameras, taking Annette's hand before they stepped out. You don't owe them anything, he said. I know, Annette replied. I owe her. Inside, the room buzzed with restrained anticipation. Microphones, notepads, faces already forming judgments. Jonathan stepped forward first. I'm not here to defend myself, he began. I'm here to correct the record. The room stilled. 6 years ago, I was pressured into signing an agreement that separated me from my child. I was told it was necessary. I was lied to. A murmur rippled through the room. Annette stepped forward then, her voice steady despite the attention. I didn't disappear, she said. I was pushed out. I was told silence was the price of survival. Jonathan watched the room shift. This was not a narrative they could easily dismiss. My daughter is not a scandal, Annette continued. She is a person. AT2310 today. Jonathan finished it. And she is my responsibility. Questions followed. Some sharp, some careful. Jonathan answered what he could. Annette answered what she chose. When it was over, they left together, shoulders squared, the noise behind them growing louder as the story escaped into the world. Back at the house near the trees, Annie waited on the porch. Did you do it? She asked. Jonathan nodded. We did. Did you tell them about me? Annie pressed. We told them you exist, Annette replied. Nothing more than that. Annie seemed to consider this. Then she smiled. Good. That night, Jonathan sat alone on the porch long after Annette and Annie had gone inside. The air was cool, the sky wide and dark above him. The worst of it was coming. He knew that. Retaliation, legal battles, public opinion shifting like sand. But for the first time, he was not bracing himself for loss. He was standing his ground. The backlash came faster than Jonathan expected. By the second morning after the press conference, the tone had shifted. What began as cautious reporting hardened into opinion. Commentators questioned motives. Old acquaintances surfaced with vague memories and sharper interpretations. Anonymous sources multiplied, each one confident, each one incomplete. Jonathan watched none of it. He sat at the kitchen table in the house near the trees, a legal brief open in front of him, untouched. Outside, Annie was kneeling in the grass, lining up smooth stones by size. Annette stood near her, arms folded, watching quietly. They're filing, Annette said when Jonathan stepped outside. I know, he replied. A civil suit. Breach of agreement. Damages. Language designed to intimidate rather than win. Jonathan had read it twice already. The point was not justice. It was pressure. They want you to panic, Annette said. They want us to retreat, Jonathan corrected. Annie looked up. Are we moving again? Jonathan crouched beside her. No, he said firmly. We're staying right here. Annie nodded, then placed another stone carefully into her line. Good, she said. I almost finished. Jonathan stood and took a breath. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. It grounded him in a way boardrooms never had. Inside, his attorney waited. They're asking for mediation again, the attorney said. Closed door. Confidential. They'll drop the suit if you retract. As Jonathan shook his head. No retractions. They're prepared to make this ugly, the attorney warned. Long, expensive. Jonathan glanced toward the window, where Annie's head was bent in concentration. Then we prepare to be patient, the attorney nodded. There's something else. They're floating a custody narrative. Not formally, yet. Annette stiffened. On what grounds? Stability, the attorney replied carefully. Environment, resources. Where to? Jonathan felt anger flare, sharp and immediate. They want to use money as proof of love. Yes, the attorney said. And silence as proof of consent. Jonathan stood. They won't get either. That afternoon, Jonathan made a decision he had avoided for weeks. He called a press liaison not to manage optics, but to set boundaries. No photos of Annie, no speculation about her school, her home, her routines. Any outlet that crossed the line would face immediate legal action. Some complied, some did not. Jonathan learned quickly who valued ethics and who valued clicks. That evening, Annette cooked dinner. Simple food. Familiar rhythms. Annie set the table with exaggerated care, counting forks aloud. Do we eat like this now? She asked, smiling. Yes, Jonathan said. If you want, Annie considered. I like it. During dinner, the conversation drifted to small things. A book Annie wanted to read, a trail she wanted to explore. Annette mentioned a job interview she had postponed. Take it, Jonathan said. Don't pause your life because of this. Annette studied him. You're sure? Yes, he replied. This fight doesn't get to steal more time. After dinner, Jonathan stepped onto the porch alone. His phone buzzed. A message from his father. You're forcing our hand. Jonathan typed a reply, then erased it. He set the phone face down and watched the sky darken. Power, he realized, was loud when challenged. It relied on fatigue, on waiting for people to tire of telling the truth. Inside, Annie padded out onto the porch and sat beside him, pulling her knees up. Are you thinking hard again? She asked. Yes, Jonathan said. About bad things. About hard things. Annie nodded. Hard things don't last forever. How do you know? Jonathan asked. She shrugged. Because my mom says if they did, nobody would survive. Jonathan smiled faintly. She's right. Over. Later that night, Annette joined them. She stood beside Jonathan, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "They'll keep coming," she said quietly. "I know," Jonathan replied, "but they're running out of leverage." Annette looked at him. "You're different than you were." He met her gaze. "I'm done choosing comfort over courage." That night, as Annie slept, Jonathan reviewed the timeline again. Each decision, each signature, each silence. He saw it clearly now, not as a tragedy, but as a pattern. And patterns could be broken. The next day would bring depositions, statements, attempts to isolate and exhaust them. But for the first time since this began, Jonathan felt something solid beneath his feet. Resolve was not loud. It was durable. The deposition was scheduled for a gray Thursday morning. Jonathan arrived early, not because he needed time to prepare, but because he wanted the room to feel familiar before it filled with voices designed to corner him. The conference space was sterile glass walls, long table, chairs placed with deliberate symmetry. Across the city, similar rooms waited for Annette, for lawyers, for anyone who could be pressured into forgetting what mattered. Annette arrived 10 minutes later. She wore a simple navy jacket and carried no bag. She looked smaller than Jonathan remembered from the press conference, but steadier. When she sat beside him, she did not reach for his hand. She did not need to. "They'll try to tire you," Jonathan said quietly. "They won't," Annette replied. "I've been tired for years." The attorneys entered. Polite greetings, paper shuffling. The ritual began. Jonathan answered questions with precision. Dates, locations, names. He did not speculate. He did not soften. When asked why he had waited 6 years, he did not defend himself. "I was lied to," he said, "and I allowed the lie to stand because it was convenient. That was my failure." The room shifted. The tactic had been to provoke denial or anger. Instead, they had been given ownership. When Annette's turn came, the tone changed. The questions grew sharper, their phrasing narrower. She answered anyway, calmly, her voice unraised. "Why didn't you contact him sooner?" "Because I was threatened," Annette replied. "Do you have proof?" "Yes," she said. "The agreement, the payments, the silence that followed. Why speak now?" Annette did not look at the attorneys. She looked at Jonathan. "Because my daughter asked me if the truth was allowed to exist." No one spoke for several seconds. The deposition ended without resolution. It had never been meant to resolve anything. It was meant to test endurance. Outside, Jonathan and Annette stood together in the cold, breath visible in the air. "You did well," Jonathan said. "So did you," Annette replied. "You didn't hide." He nodded. "I don't want to anymore." They drove back to the house near the trees in separate cars, arriving within minutes of each other. Annie was on the porch with a sketchbook, drawing the same line over and over until it became something new. "Did they ask a lot of questions?" she asked as soon as she saw them. "Yes," Jonathan said. "Did you answer?" she pressed. "Yes." Annie nodded, satisfied. "Then it's okay." That evening, the first settlement offer arrived. It was generous, carefully phrased, and came with conditions that made Jonathan's jaw tighten as he read. Confidentiality, withdrawal of statements, a joint declaration emphasizing misunderstanding and reconciliation. Annette read it once and handed it back without comment. Jonathan folded the paper. "They think money will make this quiet." Annette met his gaze. "It always has." Jonathan looked toward the window, where Annie sat on the floor, assembling a puzzle she had nearly finished twice already. "It won't this time," he said. Later, after Annie went to bed, Annette and Jonathan sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet around them. "There's something you should know," Annette said. "If this goes to court, they'll try to paint me as unstable, unreliable, unfit." Jonathan nodded. "They'll fail. They won't stop trying," Annette said. Even if it hurts her, Jonathan felt the familiar surge of anger. But he kept his voice even. "I won't let them use Annie as leverage." Annette studied him. "You're willing to put yourself in front of it." "Yes," Jonathan said. "That's what I should have done from the beginning." Annette exhaled slowly. "I don't need a savior. she said.
Yes.
I need a partner. Jonathan nodded.
I don't need
That's
a
what I want to
savior,
be.
need a partner.
Oh. The next morning, Jonathan received a call from a journalist he respected, one of the few who had honored the boundaries. They're pushing a custody angle hard, she said. It's not official yet, but it will be. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. Thank you for telling me. When he hung up, he went straight to Annie's room.
I was hoping we could
She
talk
was awake,
if you have a moment.
sitting cross-legged on the bed, reading. Can we talk? He asked. Annie closed the book and nodded. There might be people who say things about your mom, Jonathan said carefully. Unfair things. Annie frowned. Like lies? Yes, Jonathan said. Lies that sound serious. Annie thought for a moment.
You don't have to listen.
Do I have to listen to them? No,
My mother
Jonathan
tells the
replied.
truth,
You don't.
even when it
Good,
hurts.
Annie said. Because my mom tells the truth even when it's hard. Jonathan felt something settle in his chest. She does. That afternoon, Jonathan made another decision. He authorized his attorney to prepare for trial not as a threat, but as a commitment. The paperwork was heavy, the implications heavier. When Annette found out, she did not argue. You're choosing the long road, she said. Yes, Jonathan replied. Because it's the only one that ends clean. That night, Annie asked a question she had been circling for days. Are we going to be okay? She asked, curled up on the couch between them. Jonathan did not answer immediately. He chose his words carefully. Yes, he said. Not because this is easy, because we're not lying anymore. Annie nodded and leaned against him. Annette watched them both, her expression unreadable. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, steady and patient. Jonathan understood then that this was the true cost of delayed justice, not money, not reputation, not comfort. It was time. And time, once lost, demanded honesty in return. The courtroom smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant, a place designed to feel neutral but heavy with consequence. Jonathan sat at the table beside Annette, his hands folded neatly in front of him, posture straight, expression unreadable. Across the aisle, his family's legal team filled their seats with quiet confidence, briefcases aligned, faces practiced. This was not about winning. It was about refusing to retreat. The judge entered without ceremony. Everyone rose, then sat again. The room settled into a tense stillness, the kind that made every movement sound louder than it should. Jonathan listened as the opening statements unfolded. Words like agreement, consent, stability floated through the air, stripped of context, polished into something safe. When his family's attorney spoke of protecting legacy and minimizing harm, Jonathan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Legacy, he thought, was a word people used when they wanted silence to sound noble. Annette's attorney stood next. Her voice was calm, deliberate. This case is not about a contract, she said. It is about coercion, about power used to erase a mother and a child, then hide behind legality. Jonathan felt Annette shift slightly beside him, steadying herself. He did not reach for her hand. He did not need to. When Jonathan was called to the stand, the room seemed to narrow around him. He walked forward, every step measured, and took the oath without hesitation. The questions came predictably at first. Background, career, family structure. Then they sharpened. Mr. Hale, the opposing attorney said, you signed the agreement willingly, did you not? Yes, Jonathan replied. And you understood its terms? Yes. So why did you wait 6 years to contest it? Jonathan did not look at the attorney when he answered. He looked at the judge. Because I believed a lie, he said. And because I was afraid of what would happen if I challenged it. One of them. A murmur moved through the courtroom. Afraid of what, exactly? The attorney pressed. Of losing my position, Jonathan replied. My reputation. Everything I was told mattered more than a child. The attorney paused, recalibrating. And now, Jonathan met his gaze. Now I understand that fear doesn't excuse abandonment. Silence followed, heavy and complete. When Annette took the stand, the tone shifted again. The questions aimed to unravel her, to suggest instability, poor judgment, emotional decision-making. She answered each one plainly. Yes, I was scared. Yes, I accepted the money. Yes, I stayed silent. And why? The attorney asked sharply. Annette looked at the judge. Because I was told my child would be taken if I didn't. The room stilled. Did you believe them? The attorney pressed. Yes, Annette replied. Because they had already proven they could make people disappear. Where the eternal. Jonathan felt the weight of that sentence land, not just on him, but on the room itself. The proceedings lasted hours. By the time the judge called for recess, Jonathan's shoulders ached with held tension. He stepped into the hallway and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes. Annette stood beside him moments later. You okay? She asked. Yes, Jonathan replied. Are you? She nodded. I am. Oh. Down the hall, Annie sat with Jonathan's attorney, feet dangling from a chair too big for her. She looked up the moment she saw them. Is it over? She asked. For today, Jonathan said. Annie frowned. Did you tell them the truth? Yes, Annette replied. Annie nodded, satisfied. Then that's good. The decision did not come immediately. The judge took the matter under advisement, promising a ruling within days. Days that stretched like years. Back at the house near the trees, Jonathan found himself restless. He walked the property, hands in his pockets, the crunch of gravel underfoot grounding him. Annette joined him near the edge of the yard. They'll never admit they were wrong, she said. I know, Jonathan replied. But the court doesn't need them to. That night, Jonathan received one final message from his father. You're choosing strangers over blood. Jonathan stared at the words, then deleted them. Later, as Annie slept, Jonathan sat alone at the kitchen table, the house quiet around him. He thought of the choices he had made, the ones he had avoided, the cost of waiting too long to speak. Justice, he realized, was not dramatic. It was exhausting. It asked for patience when anger felt easier, for truth when silence felt safer. The next morning, the call came. Jonathan answered on the first ring. When it ended, he sat very still, the weight of the words settling slowly, deliberately. Annette found him moments later. What did they say? Jonathan looked up at her, a quiet certainty in his eyes. They ruled, he said. The agreement is void. Annette's breath caught. Full parental rights, Jonathan continued. Joint custody, immediate. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Annette covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking silently. Jonathan walked to Annie's room and knocked softly. She sat up immediately. Is it today? She asked. Yes, Jonathan said. Annie's eyes widened. Did we win? Jonathan knelt in front of her. No, he said gently. We told the truth. That's better. Annie smiled, small and sure. I knew it would matter. Jonathan felt something inside him finally ease. Not into relief, but into resolve. Outside, the world would continue to argue, to analyze, to spin. Inside, a family that had survived erasure stood together, no longer hidden, no longer silent. The ruling did not change the world overnight. There were no cheers outside the courthouse, no sudden silence from the media, no apologies from those who had tried to turn a child into a complication. The world kept moving, stubborn and noisy, as if nothing essential had shifted. But inside the small house near the trees, everything was different. Jonathan watched Annie sit at the kitchen table, her feet swinging gently as she worked on a puzzle she had nearly memorized by now. She hummed under her breath, a sound so ordinary it felt sacred. For the first time, she was not waiting, not for proof, not for permission, not for someone to decide whether she was allowed to belong. Annette stood by the sink, washing dishes slowly, methodically. When Jonathan caught her eye, she smiled a real smile this time, unguarded, almost disbelieving. It's over, she said quietly. Jonathan shook his head. No, he replied. It's finally started. Annette nodded. She understood the difference. Later that morning, Jonathan drove Annie to school himself. No cameras, no announcements, just a quiet car ride through streets dusted with early autumn light. Do I tell my teacher? Annie asked, buckling her seatbelt with careful concentration. You can tell her whatever you want, Jonathan said, or nothing at all. Annie considered this. I think I'll just tell her my dad is picking me up today. Idea of end. Jonathan felt a warmth spread through his chest at the word Dad, spoken so casually now, without fear. At the school entrance, Annie paused before opening the door. "You're coming back, right?" she asked, though her voice held less doubt than it once had. "Yes," Jonathan said. "Every day I can." She nodded and hopped out, turning back once to wave before disappearing inside. Jonathan sat in the car for a moment after she was gone, hands resting on the steering wheel. 6 years ago, this moment would have felt impossible. Today, it felt earned. When he returned to the house, Annette was waiting with a folder on the table. "Schedules," she said. "School, work, appointments." Jonathan sat across from her. "I don't want to take over," he said. "I want to fit in." Annette met his gaze. "Then start by listening." He smiled. "I'm good at that now." They talked through practical things. Holidays, routines, boundaries. They did not pretend the past had not happened. They simply refused to let it dictate the future. In the afternoon, Jonathan took a call he had been expecting. An investor. Concerned. Careful. "This has been disruptive," the voice said. "Yes," Jonathan replied. "Truth often is." There was a pause. "Are you planning to step back?" Jonathan looked out the window, toward the trees swaying gently in the breeze. "No," he said. "I'm planning to step differently." When the call ended, Jonathan felt lighter than he had in years. That evening, Annie returned from school with a drawing folded carefully in her backpack. She handed it to Jonathan with solemn ceremony. "It's for you," she said. Jonathan unfolded the paper. It showed 3 figures holding hands beneath a wide sky. The middle one was smaller. The 2 on either side, taller but leaning inward. "We're all in the same picture," Annie said, watching his face closely. Jonathan swallowed. "It's perfect." Dinner was simple. Pasta, salad, laughter that felt tentative at first, then easier. Annie told a story about a classmate who insisted clouds were just very slow animals. Annette corrected her grammar gently. Jonathan listened, absorbing the rhythm of a family finding its way. Afterward, Annie sat between them on the couch, flipping through a book. "Will people stop talking now?" she asked suddenly. "Eventually," Annette said. "And if they don't?" Annie pressed. Jonathan answered this time. "Then we keep living anyway." Annie nodded, satisfied. Later, after Annie went to bed, Jonathan stood alone on the porch. The night air was cool, the stars faint but steady. His phone buzzed with messages he no longer felt obligated to read. Annette joined him, wrapping a sweater around her shoulders. "Do you regret it?" she asked softly. Jonathan did not need to ask what she meant. "No," he said. "I regret waiting." She nodded. "Me too." They stood in silence for a moment. The past no longer a weight between them, just a shared understanding. Inside, Annie slept peacefully, her door slightly ajar, light spilling softly into the hallway. Jonathan glanced toward it instinctively, a habit already forming. "This is what justice looks like," Annette said quietly. Not loud, just real. Jonathan nodded. "And fragile." "Yes," she agreed. "That's why it needs care." As the night deepened, Jonathan felt something he had not allowed himself in a very long time. Not triumph, not relief, belonging. The story did not end with headlines. Weeks passed, then months. The noise softened, not because the truth had faded, but because it had settled into something undeniable. Scandal required uncertainty to survive. Once that was gone, the world moved on, always eager for the next distraction. Life, however, stayed. Jonathan learned the small rituals first. School drop-offs, lunches packed too carefully. The way Annie liked her toast slightly burned and her apple slices cut evenly. He learned that she hummed when she concentrated, that she grew quiet when she felt overwhelmed, that she needed time before answering hard questions. He learned how much he had missed. Annette returned to work on her own terms. Not out of necessity now, but dignity. Jonathan did not interfere, did not hover, did not try to rewrite her life with resources she had never asked for. Instead, he showed up when invited and stayed back when asked. It was harder than any courtroom battle. It mattered more. One afternoon, as autumn deepened and the leaves near the house turned amber and red, Annie came home from school with a question she had clearly been holding on to all day. "Why did they think they could take me away?" she asked, sitting at the kitchen table, her feet swinging. Jonathan did not rush his answer. "Because they believed power meant ownership," he said finally. "And because too many people let them believe that." Annie frowned.
My mom says you're my father.
"But I'm not a thing.
Is that true?
I'm mad."
Yes, it is.
"No," Jonathan said firmly.
I wanna
"You
explain
never were."
everything.
She thought about this for a moment,
The answer
then nodded.
is gently.
Okay, that was how Annie processed the world.
Ownership.
She did not linger on cruelty. She acknowledged it, placed it where it belonged, and moved on. Jonathan admired that more than anything. The first time Annie called him Dad without hesitation, without testing the word in the air, it happened by accident. She had tripped while running through the yard and scraped her knee. He was beside her before the sound of her fall had fully registered. "Dad," she said, breathless. "It hurts." He held her carefully, pressing a clean cloth to her knee, his hands steady despite the quiet shock moving through him. The word settled into him then, permanent and unremarkable at the same time. Later, alone on the porch, Jonathan sat with the necklace in his palm. The thin silver chain had been repaired, polished just enough to hold together. He had considered putting it away somewhere safe.
It feels
Instead,
simple.
he clasped it gently around Annie's neck one evening. "It was always meant for you," he said. Annie touched it with careful fingers. "It's simple," she said. Jonathan smiled. "The best things usually are." Winter came quietly.
Story.
No reporters, no court dates, just snow on the trees and long evenings filled with books and conversation. Annette and Jonathan learned how to exist in the same space without resentment, without rewriting the past, without pretending it hadn't hurt. They did not rush toward labels or promises. They chose steadiness. One night, as Annie slept curled between them on the couch after a movie she barely finished, Annette spoke softly. "You know," she said, "there was a time I thought justice meant punishment." Jonathan nodded. "So did I." "And now?" she asked. Jonathan looked down at Annie's sleeping face, peaceful and unguarded. "Now I think it means presence." Annette smiled faintly. "That sounds right." Spring returned. Annie grew taller, louder, more curious. She no longer checked to see if Jonathan was still there when she entered a room. She assumed it. That trust, Jonathan learned, was both a gift and a responsibility. On the anniversary of the day Annie had stood on that stage and spoken the words that shattered everything, Jonathan took her back to the city. Not to the building, not to the cameras, to a park. They sat on a bench, watching children run and fall and get back up again. "Do you remember that day?" Jonathan asked. Annie nodded. "I was scared." "So was I," Jonathan said. Annie tilted her head. "But you listened." "Yes," Jonathan replied. "You taught me how." She smiled, satisfied. That evening, back at the house, Jonathan wrote one last letter, not to the press, not to his family, to himself. He wrote about fear disguised as responsibility, about silence dressed up as protection, about how easy it was to believe you were doing the right thing when you were really just avoiding the cost of doing better. He folded the letter and placed it in a drawer he rarely opened. Some lessons did not need revisiting. They needed remembering. As night fell, Jonathan stood at the window, watching the lights flicker on in the distance. Annie's laughter drifted down the hallway. Annette's voice followed, calm and warm. This was not the life he had planned. It was better. Justice had not arrived with force or spectacle. It had come quietly, carried by a child brave enough to speak and adults willing to stop hiding. Jonathan Hale had built an empire once. This time, he was building something smaller and far more lasting. The story reminds us that power and respectability do not guarantee justice, and silence when chosen for comfort or fear can quietly destroy innocent lives. True responsibility is not proven by wealth, contracts, or public image, but by the courage to face the truth when it is inconvenient. The lesson is clear. Children should never have to be brave because adults chose to be silent, and real justice is not loud or vengeful. It is patient, honest, and rooted in showing up when it matters most. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.